Anna sat in the café, as if she had been transported to a completely different world. The outside world continued to bustle and hum, but here, behind the walls of this cozy corner, time seemed to slow down. The cacophony of city life, the rush of people and honking cars, faded into a soft blur. Here, within the warm embrace of the café, Anna found a rare stillness, a quiet oasis that seemed to hold its breath while the world outside continued its frantic pace. Everything around her felt soft and comforting, the wooden floors underfoot, polished and warm from years of use, the dim, golden light that bathed the room in a peaceful glow, the lingering aroma of freshly brewed coffee, and the gentle hum of classical music playing in the background. It was as though this place had been designed specifically to make her feel at ease, as if it were a refuge from the turbulent reality that had consumed her life for so long. She sat at a small table, the edges worn from use, the surface smooth beneath her fingers. She wrapped her hands around the porcelain coffee cup, savoring the warmth that seeped into her palms, a warmth that seemed to seep deeper into her soul with each passing moment. It was the only thing that felt like an ally on this chilly autumn evening. The sensation of holding the cup, its edges smooth against her fingers, seemed to tell her, "You are safe. This moment is yours." She brought the cup to her lips, inhaling the steam before taking a sip. The drink flowed down her throat, its warmth spreading through her, and with each sip, she could feel the weight of her worries begin to lift, if only for a while. Across from her sat the man she had met just a few days ago. He was her complete opposite, someone who brought a quiet, calm presence to the table. Unlike others, he didn't try too hard to start a conversation, didn't bombard her with questions or talk about his own life incessantly. Instead, everything about him was effortless, natural. There was no pretense, no pressure. He simply sat there, his gaze steady and kind, a gentle smile on his lips, looking into her eyes with a calmness that made her feel seen. His attention was different, there were no expectations, no demands. He listened, and that made all the difference. In his gaze, she didn't feel judged, nor did she feel the weight of past conversations. His eyes were like a safe harbor, inviting her to be herself without fear of rejection. There was a quiet beauty in his presence, a sincerity that was rare and precious to Anna. He didn't push her, didn't try to rush her into revealing anything she wasn't ready to share. He was patient, letting her speak when she felt like it and remaining silent when she needed the space. His questions, though few, were thoughtful and light, touching on subjects Anna hadn't thought about in a long time. They were not intrusive, yet they seemed to open up parts of her heart that had been closed for far too long. The conversation wasn't deep, yet it felt significant. It made her feel heard, important, something she hadn't realized she had been missing. He was not just a conversational partner, he was a listener, a rare and valuable thing in her world, and it was something Anna hadn't realized she craved so deeply. As the minutes passed, the words between them flowed effortlessly. With each sentence, Anna could feel herself begin to open up, as if the layers she had carefully built around herself for so long were beginning to peel away. There was no hurry, no urgency in his presence. He didn't ask for more than she was willing to give. There was no pressure to make decisions or commitments. In this moment, she was allowed to simply be. She didn't need to be anyone other than herself. And for the first time in a long while, Anna felt at peace. All the chaos, all the worries that had been weighing on her mind, seemed far away. She wasn't thinking about her husband or the children, or the life she had left behind. All that mattered was the here and now, this moment that stretched on before her like a quiet, open space. When his hand brushed against hers, her heart skipped a beat. It was just a brief, accidental touch, a fleeting moment, but it sent a jolt through her. It wasn't a passionate gesture, nor was it filled with longing. It was something far more subtle. It was a gentle, tender touch that seemed to convey a message without words: you are not alone. You are seen. You are valued. It wasn't a touch that demanded anything from her, but rather one that reassured her. The warmth of his hand, even for the briefest moment, seemed to dissolve the walls around her, and she found herself breathing a little easier. Her heart beat faster, and her breath caught in her chest, but there was no fear. Just a quiet, unexpected joy. It was as if in that single moment, everything she had been searching for, comfort, reassurance, understanding, was present in this simple connection. As she sat there, the world around her seemed to fall away. Her thoughts raced, but they didn't dwell on the past or the future. In that instant, she realized that it wasn't about what had come before or what would come next. It was about this moment, about the feeling of being alive, of being seen and understood in a way that felt both new and deeply familiar. It wasn't a grand revelation, but it was enough. Even if this was just a fleeting moment, a small episode that would soon fade into the noise of daily life, it felt significant. It felt like a gift. She didn't know what would come after this night, or what the future held, but for now, she was free of the weight of her own expectations. She was not bound by the complexities of her past or the pressures of her obligations. Here, in this small, warm café, she could breathe. And for the first time in a long time, she realized that it was enough. She felt her soul exhale, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of what might come next. Even if she would eventually have to return to the reality that waited outside these walls, Anna realized, in that fleeting moment, that sometimes simply being here, in the present, was all she needed. But all of this was destroyed when her husband suddenly entered the café. His presence was like a shadow from the past, inevitable and frightening, a reminder of everything Anna had tried to escape. The moment he walked through the door, the warmth of the café seemed to drain away, replaced by a chill that wrapped itself around her heart. She felt as if the fragile world she had been trying to build, the small sanctuary she had found in the company of a man who treated her with kindness, was suddenly shaken to its core. His eyes immediately locked onto hers, cold and distant, as though all the anger, disappointment, and frustration he had been harboring for months had concentrated into that one, piercing look. The weight of his gaze pressed down on her chest, suffocating her with an overwhelming sense of guilt. Her heart raced, but there was no way to escape. He didn't shout, didn't storm toward her with fury. Instead, he moved slowly, deliberately, each step heavier than the last. As he neared their table, the world around Anna seemed to blur, the sounds of the café fading into an eerie silence. His presence was like an anchor, dragging her back to a place she no longer wanted to be. When he sat down across from her, the space between them felt as vast as an ocean. He didn't say anything at first, but his silence was deafening. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, suffocating. Anna couldn't breathe. The walls of the café, the warmth, the calm, it all faded into nothingness. All that remained was him, and the coldness he brought with him. His eyes didn't leave hers, and in their depths, Anna saw nothing but a vast emptiness. No rage, no shouting, just silence, the kind of silence that speaks volumes, that cuts deeper than any words ever could. It was a silence that told her everything she needed to know, that whatever had been between them was gone. There would be no chance to explain, no opportunity to undo the damage. He had already decided. She could feel it in the tightness in her chest, the lump in her throat, the pressure building behind her eyes. She tried to swallow, but the weight of his gaze made it hard to move. The man she had once loved, the man she had shared so much of her life with, had become a stranger before her eyes. His very presence was a reminder of the life she had tried to outrun, the life that had slowly become suffocating in its demands. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he broke the silence. His voice was quiet but so steady, so heavy with something that felt like a final judgment. Why are you here? What are you doing with this man? The words hit her like a physical blow, and she flinched. There was no anger in his voice, no rage, just raw pain, deep, unrelenting pain. His voice was almost hollow, as if the years of frustration and betrayal had emptied him out. Anna could see the despair in his eyes, and it was like a mirror reflecting back everything she had tried to avoid. Her heart squeezed painfully as she tried to find her voice, but it was like the words had been stolen from her. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice trembled, fragile and weak, like a broken reed in the wind. She wanted to explain, to offer some defense, but no words felt right. Nothing could fix what had already been shattered. Every word she spoke felt like it was echoing in a vast emptiness, as though they carried no weight, no meaning. She stumbled over her explanations, but they felt hollow, meaningless. She could see it in his eyes, he wasn't listening anymore. His gaze was colder now, sharper, and she realized that whatever had happened between them, whatever they had once shared, was irreparably broken. The man she had once known, the person she had believed in, was gone. And the person sitting across from her, staring at her with so much pain and disappointment, was no longer her husband. He was a stranger who had walked into her life and now was about to walk out of it for good. As his questions grew more vague, more desperate, Anna felt herself retreat further into the silence. She couldn't answer, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew that no matter what she said, nothing could restore the intimacy and trust that had been lost. His eyes no longer softened with the warmth she had once known. There was no tenderness, no understanding, only disappointment, growing deeper with every passing second. And she realized that in the end, it wasn't just about what had happened between them. It was about the fact that they had grown so far apart that there was no way back. The silence between them now was more deafening than any words could have been. He stood up, and with that single motion, it was as if the last thread connecting them had snapped. The finality of it hit Anna with the force of a storm. His departure wasn't dramatic, but it felt like the end of everything they had once shared. He didn't say anything more, didn't offer any final words of hope or closure. He simply walked away, leaving her there, alone. The weight of his absence settled in her chest like a stone. Anna sat in the chair, stunned. The café, once warm and inviting, now felt suffocating. The gentle hum of the background music, the smell of coffee, the light from the lamps, it all seemed so distant, so unimportant. It was as if the world had stopped spinning the moment he walked out the door. She wanted to scream, to cry, to fight for something that she knew was already gone, but she couldn't. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. The silence was too loud now, too overwhelming. Her thoughts scattered, like leaves caught in a whirlwind. There were no answers, no solutions. Only a crushing realization that this moment, this silence, was the end. There would be no going back. The hope she had clung to, the dream of reconciliation, of rebuilding something from the ashes, had disappeared. It had all vanished the moment he walked out of that café. And in that moment, Anna knew she couldn't return to the person she had been before. She couldn't go back to the life she had once known. There was no way to fix what had been broken, no way to undo the choices that had led her here. She sat there for what felt like an eternity, her hands trembling around her coffee cup, the warmth from the porcelain doing nothing to soothe the coldness that had settled inside her. The café was still full of life, still bustling with the energy of the world outside. But Anna felt as if she were suspended in time, caught between two worlds, the one she had been trying to leave behind, and the one that now seemed impossible to embrace. In the end, she realized, there was no easy way forward. Only the pain of what had been lost, and the uncertain weight of what lay ahead. Anna stood there, her hand resting lightly against the cool glass of the café window, her gaze lost in the reflection of the darkened street outside. The night had settled in, and the city seemed to hum with its usual rhythm, unaware of the turmoil inside her. But for Anna, everything had come to a standstill. The sounds of the city were drowned out by the overwhelming silence in her mind. Her heart, once full of hope and dreams, now felt hollow, weighed down by the weight of her own decisions. The café, once a safe haven, now seemed foreign, just like the life she had created. The life she had destroyed. The man across from her had not moved, his presence a quiet constant in the midst of her emotional storm. She could feel his eyes on her as she returned to the table, each step heavier than the last. But she knew, Deep down, that the weight of her burden could no longer be hidden or ignored. Everything was unraveling, and the questions she had tried to push away, the ones she had never dared to answer, were now pressing in on her. As she sat down again, the chair seemed to swallow her whole, and she felt small, as if the very walls of the cafe were closing in on her. His gaze was still soft, but Anna could sense the shift in the air. There was no judgment in his eyes, no rush for her to explain. But there was something else, something more profound. Perhaps it was a quiet understanding, an awareness that her internal struggle had just reached its breaking point. She swallowed, the lump in her throat thickening with each passing second. Her hands trembled as they rested on the table, and her eyes fell to the empty cup in front of her. It seemed so insignificant now, just a vessel that once held warmth, now only a reminder of how far she had fallen. She could feel the weight of his silence, but it wasn't oppressive, it was something else. A space, a room for her to breathe, to think, to feel without the constant pressure of expectations. But Anna wasn't sure if she wanted to feel anymore. She wasn't sure if she wanted to face what was happening inside her. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cafe. The words were out before she could stop them, raw and unfiltered. She looked up at him, her eyes searching for something, but she didn't know what. His expression softened, and for a moment, Anna thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, something like empathy, but there was no pity. He didn't speak right away, and she was grateful for it. There was no rush, no pressure to fill the silence with more words. The quiet between them now felt different, more comfortable, more knowing. "I don't think anyone really knows what they're doing," he finally said, his voice calm and steady. "But sometimes, we have to let ourselves be lost for a while, just to find the path we were meant to take." Anna exhaled slowly, his words lingering in the air like a soft balm on a wound. She wasn't sure if she believed them, but they didn't sound like empty platitudes. They sounded like truth, or, at least, something she needed to hear. Something that gave her permission to not have all the answers. Her thoughts swirled again, and for a moment, she let herself drift. She thought of her children, of the life she had once shared with her husband, of the family she had tried to hold together for so long. And yet, all of that seemed so distant now. Like an old photograph, faded and yellowed with time. The love, the connection, where had it gone? How had it become so fragile? She had tried to keep everything intact, to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect everything. But in the process, she had lost herself. And now, standing at the crossroads of her life, she realized that she didn't know who she was anymore. The woman who had smiled at her husband across the dinner table, who had held her children close, who had once dreamed of a future filled with warmth, she was gone. Anna looked at the man sitting across from her. His presence was still calm, still steady, but now, she saw something else in him. It wasn't pity, nor was it expectation. It was understanding, quiet and unwavering. As if he could see the battle raging inside her, as if he knew the weight of her choices, yet he offered no judgment. "I'm not asking you to fix everything," he said gently, his voice cutting through her tangled thoughts. "But it's okay to feel lost. It's okay to not know what comes next. Sometimes, you just have to let yourself breathe." Anna nodded slowly, the weight in her chest easing just a little. It was true, she hadn't given herself permission to feel lost, to admit that she didn't know how to make things right. The idea that it was okay to be uncertain, to feel broken, was a foreign concept to her. But now, in the quiet of this cafe, it felt like a small step toward healing. She met his gaze, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she allowed herself to be seen. To be vulnerable, to be honest. "I don't know how to go back," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can." The man didn't respond immediately, and for a brief moment, Anna thought he might not say anything at all, but then he leaned forward, his eyes softening even more. "You don't have to go back," he said. "You don't have to fix everything at once. All you can do is take the next step." Whatever that may be. Anna closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of his words settling over her like a blanket. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know what her next step would be, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like it was okay not to have all the answers. It was okay to be unsure. And in that uncertain space, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. It was fragile, delicate, but it was there. And for now, that was enough. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs, and exhaled slowly. Tomorrow, she would face whatever came next. But tonight, in this quiet corner of the world, she was allowed to simply be. And for the first time in what felt like forever, that was enough. The house Anna returned to after that meeting in the café had become a place she no longer recognized. It loomed before her like a specter of her former life. The walls that had once held the echoes of laughter, the warmth of shared moments, now felt suffocating. It was as if everything inside it had turned against her, and even though the furniture, the pictures on the walls, and the worn carpets remained the same, they had all become hostile, alien reminders of what was slipping away. The front door closed behind her with an almost deliberate finality, as if sealing her inside a tomb. She stood frozen on the threshold for a long moment, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The air in the house felt thick, heavy, as though it had absorbed every unspoken word, every moment of tension, and every fleeting glance of regret. The faint creak of the floorboards beneath her seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. She moved slowly, her footsteps echoing through the house, an eerie reminder of her isolation. It was as though the walls themselves had turned their back on her. The hallway she once knew so well stretched before her like a darkened tunnel, its familiar turns and corners now suffocating. Her eyes moved across the worn photo frames that lined the walls, pictures of happier days, moments frozen in time. But the faces in those photographs seemed distant, unreachable. She wanted to reach out to them, to connect to that version of herself, but the more she tried, the further away it felt. Her hands moved automatically, touching the familiar surfaces, as if she could will everything back to how it once was. The books on the shelves, the soft armchair by the window where they had once sat together, the table where they'd shared countless meals, all of it seemed so foreign now. She felt like a stranger in her own home. And with that realization, the emptiness in her chest deepened, spreading outward, consuming every part of her. When she finally made her way to the kitchen, her eyes immediately fell on the note left by her husband. It sat there, as if mocking her with its simplicity, its brevity. "You lost me." The words burned into her, each letter feeling like an accusation, a judgment that she could neither escape nor undo. They had been written with such finality, so cold and sharp, as if to seal the fate of what had once been. She could not look away, could not tear herself from the note as it anchored her in the crushing realization that this, whatever this was the end. There would be no forgiveness, no reconciliation. It was finished. The walls seemed to close in around her as she sank into the nearest chair, her body folding under the weight of her grief. The note, still in her trembling hands, felt like a shackle, chaining her to the past she could not change. The house, which had once been her sanctuary, now seemed to trap her in an unrelenting cycle of despair. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of the children's toys scattered across the floor, objects of innocence now reduced to reminders of everything she had failed to protect. The silence was deafening. Every room was filled with a kind of sorrowful stillness that seemed to vibrate in the air, amplifying the sound of her own heartbeat. She reached for the phone again, the desperate hope that somehow, through one more message or call, things could be fixed, that she could undo the damage. But each attempt was met with the same bitter silence. Her heart sank lower with every unanswered call, each failure a reminder that her husband was not coming back. Not today, not ever. She sank deeper into the chair, unable to tear herself from the weight of her thoughts. How had she come to this? How had it all crumbled so quickly, so completely? What had she missed? How could she have seen the cracks and not done anything about them? She searched her memories for a moment where everything had gone wrong, but the timeline of her failures was a blur, each misstep woven into the next until it was impossible to tell where it had all gone wrong. The quiet tick of the wall clock was the only sound in the room, like the slow, relentless march of time. But Anna wasn't sure if it was moving forward or backward, or if it had stopped entirely. She felt suspended in this moment of realization, unable to move forward, unable to retreat into the past. She closed her eyes, letting her head rest against the back of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could feel the tears threatening, but no longer had the energy to cry. It felt as though her soul itself was dry, drained of all emotion, leaving only the hollow echo of what was once there. The children's laughter, once the light of her life, now felt like an intrusion. They moved around the house, their small voices asking questions, pulling her from her thoughts, but Anna could not find the strength to engage. Each question, each innocent word, felt like a knife twisting in her chest. How could she answer them, when she couldn't even answer herself? She had promised to be strong for them, to protect them, but now, she was the one who needed saving, and there was no one left to save her. She watched them play in the next room, their voices distant, as though they were in another world entirely. And she was the outsider. A mother who could no longer mother, a wife who had lost everything. The day dragged on in a blur, each minute a struggle, and when night fell, the house felt colder, darker. The faint glow of the lamp in the living room cast long, strange shadows on the walls. Anna looked around one last time before retreating to the bedroom. The house no longer felt like a home. It was a tomb, a hollow shell filled with echoes of a life that no longer belonged to her. She lay down, staring at the ceiling, the emptiness pressing down on her from all sides. The pain was no longer a sharp, immediate sensation, it had become a constant hum beneath her skin, something she could no longer escape. As the hours passed, she felt her grip on everything she had once known slipping further away. The past was gone, the present was suffocating, and the future. The future felt like a distant concept, something she could no longer reach for. Anna closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself drift into sleep, into the only escape that remained. But even in her dreams, there was no peace. The drive back was a blur. The fog, thick and suffocating, clung to her windshield as she navigated the winding road, the headlights casting weak pools of light that barely cut through the haze. Every mile felt like a weight added to her chest, pushing the air from her lungs. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being pulled into an abyss, that no matter how fast she drove, no matter how far she went, she would never outrun the crushing sense of loss. Anna's mind was a storm of unanswered questions, but they were all fading, one by one, like the faintest echoes. What did I think would happen? She asked herself. How could I believe that returning to that house, to that lake, would somehow undo the damage I caused? The question seemed as irrelevant as her efforts to fix the irreparable. What had been broken couldn't be repaired with a few words, with a moment of vulnerability. She had wanted him to see her, see the regret, the hope, the desperation to rebuild, but instead, he had looked past her, and in his eyes, she had seen the nothingness that now defined their relationship. The words he had spoken echoed in her mind, over and over. I need time to understand what to do next. But it wasn't the lack of forgiveness that hurt most. It was the absence of emotion, the empty space between them that had once been filled with shared dreams, hopes, and love. He wasn't angry with her, he wasn't accusing her, he was simply indifferent. And that, more than anything, was what tore her apart. The feeling of being unseen, unheard, like a ghost passing through a life she no longer inhabited. He wasn't sure he'd ever forgive her. The sentence hung in the air like a death knell. She wiped her eyes, but the tears kept coming, hot and bitter. The mist outside her car had begun to thin, but it felt as though it had found its way inside her heart, smothering every flicker of hope that might have remained. The world around her had turned gray and shapeless, mirroring the turmoil inside. There was no clarity, no direction, just an endless stretch of road, leading nowhere. As she passed familiar landmarks on the road, the house they had lived in together, the old café where they used to talk for hours, it all felt so distant. These places, once filled with meaning, now seemed to mock her. What had they been? What was the point of all those years? And now she had nothing left to show for it, just empty spaces where love used to be. Anna's grip on the steering wheel tightened, and she pushed forward through the fog, though her mind was anything but focused on the road ahead. What could she possibly do now? She couldn't undo the past. She couldn't undo the years of silence, the moments when she had chosen to ignore the cracks in their relationship. She had thought, at some point, that love would be enough, that they could weather any storm. But now, the storm had passed, and all that was left was the wreckage. She had imagined returning to the lake would somehow bring them back to a time when everything was simpler, when they had been happy. She had imagined that the place where their love had once bloomed would be the place where they could begin again. But instead, it had felt like the final nail in the coffin of their relationship. The lake, with its still waters and thick fog, had become a metaphor for everything that had withered between them. There was no going back. Her phone buzzed in her lap, but Anna didn't have the strength to look. She already knew it was him, another message, perhaps, or a call she couldn't bring herself to answer. What could he say now that he hadn't already said? I need space. I need time. Was there even any space left for her in his life? Or was she destined to remain a shadow of the woman she used to be, someone she barely recognized? Someone he had already left behind. As she drove, the feeling of being utterly alone consumed her. She had always thought of herself as strong, as someone who could handle anything life threw her way. But this was different. This wasn't something she could fix. This was the final consequence of everything she had done, everything she had allowed to slip away. The weight of it was suffocating. The car veered to the side as her vision blurred with the tears that had not yet stopped falling. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her mind, but it was no use. The road stretched on, endless and unyielding, and she realized that it wasn't just the fog outside her car that had swallowed everything, it was the fog inside her as well. She couldn't see the way forward, couldn't see any way out. There was no more clarity, no more hope, only emptiness. The headlights cut through the mist, but they did little to illuminate her path. The dark road ahead was a reflection of her own heart, desolate, without purpose. She slowed down, her hands shaking as they gripped the wheel tighter. The world outside had become an indistinct blur of gray and shadow, just like her soul. She wasn't sure if she was driving towards home or just away from everything. And maybe it didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the painful, crushing silence between them, the one she couldn't escape. The one she had created. Anna spent the following weeks in a fog, drifting between moments of clarity and despair. She had spent so many nights awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to find a way to make things right, to reach him, to restore the love they had once shared. But the more she tried, the more distant he became. She felt as though she were speaking to a ghost, the man she once knew now a hollow figure, a shadow that only vaguely resembled the person she had once called her partner. Her home had become a place of suffocating silence. She no longer found comfort in its familiar walls, in the quiet corners that once echoed with laughter and whispered conversations. Each room felt colder than the last, a space where memories came to die, a place where the warmth they had built together had been erased by the weight of her failures. She moved through it like a ghost herself, performing daily rituals out of habit, cleaning, cooking, looking after the children, but nothing seemed to fill the emptiness that had taken hold of her soul. The children, unaware of the emotional storm that raged inside their mother, continued to bring her fleeting moments of brightness. Their chatter, their innocent questions, their small attempts to cheer her up, were the only things that kept her from crumbling completely. She held onto them like a lifeline, but even their joy couldn't lift the heaviness that clung to her heart. She couldn't help but wonder if, one day, they would see the cracks in her facade, if they would understand the pain that lingered in her every movement, in the silence that had become her constant companion. But it was the quiet moments, the moments when she was alone, that hurt the most. The evenings were the hardest. When the children were asleep, the house fell into an unbearable stillness. She would sit in the living room, surrounded by memories of a time when things had been better, when they had shared their hopes and dreams, when the future had felt bright. But now, everything seemed distant. She would run her fingers over the surface of the table where they used to eat dinner together, trace the edge of the worn couch where they had once curled up, and feel a deep, gnawing emptiness inside. It was as if every object in the house had become a symbol of what was lost, a reminder of the life she had failed to protect. It was one of those nights when she sat in the kitchen, staring at the cold cup of coffee in front of her, that the truth finally hit her: she had to let go. She couldn't keep holding on to the past, to the man he had once been, to the love that no longer existed. It was time to stop trying to fix something that was beyond repair. She had spent so many years looking for a way back, but now she realized that the only way forward was to accept that their relationship, as they had known it, was over. The idea of moving on, of releasing him, of releasing herself from the pain of what could never be again, felt like a betrayal in some way, but it was also the only path to healing. The thought of letting go wasn't as liberating as she had imagined. It didn't bring her the peace she had hoped for. Instead, it felt like a quiet surrender, an acknowledgement of the truth that she had been avoiding. She didn't know how to move forward, didn't know what life would look like without him, without them. But she knew she couldn't keep clinging to a past that was gone. Anna stood up from the table, the weight of her decision settling in her chest like a stone. She walked to the window, her gaze drifting out into the night. The fog was still there, wrapping itself around the house, much like the sense of loss that had settled over her. But now, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel as if she were drowning in it. She still felt the heaviness, but it was different, more like a burden she had learned to carry rather than a force threatening to pull her under. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be days when she would want to call him, when she would wonder if there was any chance left for them. But deep down, she understood that the only way to truly move forward was to accept that some things were beyond repair. Some things were meant to break, and all she could do now was pick up the pieces and learn to live with the cracks. The next morning, Anna woke up with a new determination. She would let go. She would stop holding on to the past, stop waiting for answers that might never come. She would focus on what was in front of her now: her children, her own healing, her future. The weight of the decision hung over her like a shadow, but for the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was suffocating. She had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life, toward finding her own way again. It was a small, uncertain step, but it was a step forward. And that, for now, was enough. Anna's life had become a battlefield, where every emotion seemed to be at war with the next. The more she tried to move forward, the more she felt herself sinking deeper into a well of confusion. Oleg had become a source of light in her otherwise dark existence. His presence was soothing, like the calm after a storm. He listened to her when she needed to talk, offered her comfort when she felt lost, and gave her something she hadn't felt in months: attention, care, and validation. But with every conversation, Anna felt herself torn in two. Her thoughts were a constant whirlwind, spiraling between the warmth she found in Oleg's eyes and the cold distance that had grown between her and her husband. Oleg never asked for more than friendship, but she could see the way he looked at her, a glance that lingered a moment too long, a touch that was more intimate than necessary. He was becoming a temptation, a way out of the painful limbo she found herself in, yet, with every small advance, a deep sense of guilt followed. She couldn't deny that she was falling for him. But how could she reconcile these feelings with the love she still had for her husband, even if that love had become a shadow of its former self? Oleg didn't understand the complexity of her emotions. He didn't know that every moment spent with him was a painful reminder of the life she had abandoned. In his eyes, Anna was someone worth fighting for, someone who deserved happiness and affection. She knew this, and it both comforted and scared her. She had never felt desired in such a way before, and the warmth he gave her was intoxicating. Yet, she could not shake the image of her husband. Despite his silence, his emotional withdrawal, she couldn't forget the love they once shared, the life they had built, the dreams they had made together. Every evening, after work, Anna found herself in a constant state of turmoil. She would sit alone in the quiet house, the silence stretching like a heavy weight around her. She would think of Oleg, of his smile, the way he'd casually touch her arm as they shared a joke. Then, without fail, her thoughts would shift to her husband, to the empty chair at the dinner table, to the coldness in his eyes when he looked at her. How could she want someone else when she was still so tied to him, still so full of memories, still so filled with regret over the pain she had caused him? Oleg had become a refuge, but Anna knew it wasn't right to hide behind him, to seek comfort in his arms while her heart was still with someone else. She had always prided herself on her ability to make decisions, to fix things, to navigate the complex paths of life. But now, she felt paralyzed, trapped between two impossible choices, and the weight of that indecision was suffocating. She knew she couldn't keep living this way. Something had to give. One evening, as she sat with Oleg in a quiet café after work, something shifted between them. He looked at her with a tenderness that made her heart flutter. "Anna," he said gently, his voice softer than usual, "I know things have been difficult for you. But I want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what. If you ever want to talk, or if you just need someone to listen, I'm always here." His words hit her like a wave, both soothing and terrifying. It was the first time he had openly offered her a glimpse of what could be. He was offering her something her husband no longer could: warmth, understanding, a sense of being wanted, and more than that, a way out of the dark hole she had been trapped in for months. And yet, it felt wrong. She wasn't ready. She couldn't just step into a new life without confronting the past first. "Thank you, Oleg," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know what to say. I appreciate everything you've done for me, but I can't just forget everything that's happened. I can't forget my husband, even if things are hard between us now. I need time. I need to figure this out on my own." Oleg nodded, his expression softening. "I understand," he said, but there was a trace of sadness in his eyes. "Just know that I'm here, whenever you're ready." The words lingered in the air, and Anna felt a pang of guilt. It was clear that Oleg cared for her, but it was equally clear that she was still not ready to move on from her past, from the relationship that had once meant everything to her. That night, as Anna lay in bed, her thoughts were a tangle of emotions. She thought of her husband, of their life together, of the mistakes she had made. She thought of Oleg, who had been a source of light in her darkness, who had given her the strength to get through each day. She felt herself drawn to him, but at the same time, she knew she couldn't ignore the fact that her heart still belonged, at least in part, to the man she had once loved. The conflict was unbearable. She couldn't keep living this double life, torn between her husband's memory and the warmth Oleg offered. The guilt, the confusion, the longing, it was all consuming. She knew she had to make a decision, but how could she choose between the past and the future? How could she let go of one man to move forward with another when her heart was still caught in the web of regret and unspoken words? Anna's journey was far from over. The emotional chaos was far from resolved. But in that moment, she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't continue running from the truth forever. She would have to face it, and in doing so, face herself. The question was no longer about who she loved or who she could be with. It was about finding a way to heal, to move forward, and to accept the complexities of her heart, no matter where it led. Anna's internal war had become unbearable, a constant tug of war that left her exhausted and emotionally depleted. Every day felt like an impossible choice, each decision a reminder of her fractured world. Oleg, with his patience and warmth, had crept into her heart in a way that both comforted and terrified her. In his presence, she found a safe haven, a stark contrast to the coldness and distance that had settled between her and her husband. But as much as Oleg made her feel alive again, she couldn't deny that a part of her still clung to the past, to the man who had once been everything to her. Her husband, the one with whom she had built a family, shared years of her life, and dreamed of a future together, still lingered in her thoughts. Even though the walls between them had grown thicker, even though the love they once had seemed like a distant memory, Anna couldn't let go. She couldn't entirely erase the person who had been by her side through both joy and sorrow. The history they had shared was too rich, too intertwined with her sense of self. And yet, every attempt to rebuild what they had only deepened the pain. Every word, every silence from him felt like a reminder that the love they had was no longer enough to hold them together. Meanwhile, Oleg, who had entered her life at a time of great vulnerability, had become the person she turned to in her darkest moments. His care was a balm to the wounds she had carried for so long. With Oleg, there was no judgment, no bitterness. He offered her a chance to rediscover herself, not as a wife or mother, but as a woman, worthy of attention and love. His gaze, full of understanding, had become a refuge, and Anna began to imagine what life could be like with him, a life without the heavy weight of the past dragging her down. But as she found solace in Oleg, she also found herself drowning in guilt. How could she betray her husband like this? Even though their relationship had crumbled, part of her still felt bound to him by the memories they had created together, by the children they had brought into the world. She couldn't shake the feeling that by moving forward with Oleg, she was turning her back on everything that had once mattered. It was as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice, too afraid to take a step forward, but too aware that staying where she was would only deepen her despair. Anna spent sleepless nights tossing and turning, replaying every moment in her mind. She thought of the years spent with her husband, the laughter, the shared dreams, the tenderness that had once existed between them. It all felt like a distant memory now, one that had been overshadowed by the weight of their recent struggles. But could she really give up on that history? Could she walk away from the life they had built, the life they had promised to each other? Her heart ached at the thought of abandoning her children's father, of tearing apart the last vestiges of the family she had once cherished. And then there was Oleg. The thought of building a new life with him filled her with both hope and fear. Could she really move on so completely from the man she had married, from the life they had shared? Every time she looked at Oleg, she saw a future filled with possibilities, a future where she could be happy again, where she could heal and rediscover joy. But could she build that future on the foundation of someone else's love, knowing that it came at the cost of the past she still couldn't entirely let go of? Her emotions were a tangle of contradictions. She wanted to be honest with herself, to choose a path that would lead to true happiness. But the choice before her felt like a betrayal of everything she had ever known. The pull of her past and the promise of a new beginning with Oleg left her paralyzed, unable to take a step in either direction. One evening, as she sat alone in the quiet house, her mind swirling with indecision, a thought struck her with overwhelming clarity. She realized that this wasn't just about choosing between two men. It was about choosing herself, about finding the strength to heal and move forward, regardless of what had happened in the past. She needed to make peace with her own heart, to accept that both love and pain were a part of her journey. She couldn't keep holding on to the past, nor could she ignore the new possibilities that had emerged in her life. Anna knew that to move forward, she would have to make a decision, not just about Oleg or her husband, but about what kind of woman she wanted to be. She needed to accept that her happiness could no longer be tied to one person, to one life. It had to come from within. And that realization, while painful, also felt like the first step toward freedom. The following day, Anna sat down with her husband. The conversation was painful, but necessary. She spoke honestly, explaining the depths of her confusion, the turmoil she had been feeling, and how she had come to understand that their marriage, as it had been, could no longer be salvaged. Her husband listened in silence, his face unreadable. For the first time in months, Anna felt a sense of release, as if a weight had been lifted. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, that there would be more pain and heartache before any healing could begin. But she also knew that this was the only way forward, to face the truth, to let go, and to finally make room for a new chapter in her life. In the days that followed, Anna began to distance herself from the emotional pull of both her husband and Oleg. She needed time to rediscover who she was, without the influence of either man. She focused on her children, on her own well-being, and on finding the strength to move forward. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Anna felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't ready to make any final decisions about her future with Oleg. But she knew that whatever happened, she would no longer be defined by the choices of her past. She would find her own way, a way that was hers alone. Anna stood motionless by the window, the cold glass pressed against her palm. The world outside seemed to mirror the turmoil inside her, a vast, unyielding expanse, where nothing felt warm or inviting. The familiar hum of the city was distant, as if it too had become irrelevant to her. Her thoughts swirled in a vortex of confusion and exhaustion, each one heavier than the last. The path forward had become a blur, a maze with no exits, and she felt as though she had been walking in circles for too long. Her life, once full of certainty and purpose, had unraveled. The marriage she had fought for, with its dreams and shared history, had long since slipped beyond reach. Every effort to rebuild, to find even a spark of what had once been between them, had failed. Her husband's indifference, the way he had slowly withdrawn from her, left her in a place where she no longer recognized the person who had once been her partner. His coldness had infected everything, and every conversation with him now felt like speaking to a stranger. That feeling of intimacy, of connection, was gone, replaced by silence, by an emptiness that seemed to echo in the very walls of their home. Oleg had stepped in when the darkness threatened to overwhelm her, offering support, kindness, and understanding when her husband could not. His presence had been a balm to her wounded soul, a reminder that she was still capable of feeling valued, desired, and heard. But even with Oleg's unwavering patience and care, Anna couldn't escape the gnawing guilt that clung to her like a shadow. She felt torn in two, her heart caught between the life she had once known with her husband and the fragile possibility of a new beginning with Oleg. The pull of both men had become a heavy weight, one that threatened to crush her under its pressure. She had tried to hold on to both worlds, to balance her past with her present, but the cost had been too high. The emotional toll of living in constant conflict had stripped her of her sense of self. The woman she had once been, confident, certain, and capable, now felt like a distant memory, an illusion she could no longer touch. Her choices no longer seemed to lead to freedom, but to deeper entanglements, to paths that spiraled into confusion and despair. The conversation with her husband had been inevitable, but it had brought no answers. She had walked into it hoping to find some small sign that the man she had once loved was still there, buried beneath the layers of bitterness and resentment. But all she had found was a hollow shell, someone who no longer shared her pain, her hopes, or even her memories. The emptiness in his eyes had confirmed what she had feared. He was lost to her, as much a part of her past as the life they had once shared. His words, "I need time," had done nothing to soothe the churning storm inside her. They were just words, empty and meaningless, like the space between them. Leaving him there, standing in their living room, had felt like an admission of defeat. She had hoped, for so long, that somehow things could be fixed, that they could heal, but it was clear now that no amount of wishing could change the truth. There was no going back. Outside, the cold air bit at her skin as she stepped into the world that no longer seemed to make sense. She didn't go to Oleg, even though she knew he would be there for her. His concern, his unwavering presence, had once felt like a lifeline. But now, it seemed distant, like an offering she was too broken to accept. What did she need from him? What could he give her that she had not already tried to find in her husband? Her heart felt hollow, devoid of the clarity it once had. Anna wandered aimlessly, feeling the weight of her own existence pressing down on her. The question of what to do, of who to choose, seemed insignificant now. Perhaps neither man could save her. Perhaps no one could. She had become so enmeshed in the pain of her past and the uncertainty of her present that she couldn't see a future. She felt like a leaf caught in the wind, tossed around with no direction, no purpose. Returning home to the quiet of the apartment felt like walking into a void. The once familiar space, filled with the remnants of a life she had tried so hard to hold on to, now felt suffocating. Her husband's things still lay scattered around, his jacket on the back of the chair, his shoes by the door, all reminders of a life she no longer recognized. The walls, once filled with laughter and love, now stood silent, as though they, too, were mourning the loss. Anna sat on the couch, staring at the empty room. The weight of the silence pressed in on her, and for the first time, she didn't try to fill it with thoughts of the future or the past. She simply existed in that moment, consumed by the stillness. Oleg's presence seemed as distant as her husband's. Both were like shadows, fading in and out of her consciousness, unable to provide the answers she so desperately sought. She had hoped that love, in its various forms, would be the answer. She had hoped that by choosing one path, by committing to one person, she could find the peace she had been searching for. But now, she saw the painful truth. There was no easy answer, no perfect choice. The internal conflict that had been eating away at her had only left her more fractured, more unsure of herself than ever. The life she had once imagined for herself, the future she had hoped to build, seemed like a distant dream, a dream that had slipped through her fingers, lost in the fog of regret and longing. She stood again, walked to the window, and gazed out at the stars. They seemed so far away, so indifferent to her pain. The world kept turning, oblivious to her suffering, and in that moment, Anna realized the harsh truth: she was alone. She had spent so much time trying to navigate the expectations of others, trying to salvage relationships that had already been broken, that she had forgotten what it meant to truly understand herself. Her life, once full of meaning and purpose, had become a maze of contradictions. The choices she had made had not brought her closer to happiness, but had only led her further into despair. She had been searching for something outside herself to fix the brokenness inside her, but the truth was she had to face that brokenness on her own. She could no longer rely on others to fill the emptiness, the void that only she could heal. The final break had come not with a single, definitive choice, but with the realization that she could not keep living in this state of confusion. She had to make peace with herself, with the pain, and with the fact that some things could never be repaired. The stars outside the window seemed cold and distant, yet they offered her a kind of solace, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the world continued on. She too would have to continue, even if it meant walking a path alone, even if the journey ahead was uncertain. The only certainty now was that the past was gone, and the future was hers to shape, even if she couldn't yet see how. Anna took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill her lungs. It was time to face the silence, to find her way forward in the quiet. The road ahead would be hard, but it would be hers.